So let's talk about Overwatch 2. Is it really a sequel, or is it just Overwatch 1.5? So it's not really a sequel in a traditional sense, I don't think anyway. I think that Overwatch 2 has a massive mountain to climb if we are to see it to become a true sequel, and I don't think it can possibly become a true sequel until its PvE mode comes out next year. To be honest, I think that a sequel really does need a lot of new content, and Overwatch 2 doesn't really provide a lot of new content. It's kind of just a continuation of what Overwatch 1 started. So if we're talking about sequels and what they really need to provide, I think that Overwatch 2 does provide some of those things. So for example, it provides new heroes, so like for example Sojourn, Junker Queen and Kiriko, all of which are incredibly well designed. They're all really good Overwatch classic heroes that really bring new abilities and new ways to play to the table, and I've started to main every one of them because they're all incredibly well designed and balanced and really fun to play. There's also the fact that the game was launched sort of anew as a free-to-play game, which I think it does take the sting off the deletion of Overwatch 1, but I think that also does come with a lot of its own problems and issues. So for example, a lot of people would argue that in Overwatch 1 the loot box systems were incredibly pay to win, but if you really look at those loot box systems, it's not quite that simple, because they were only cosmetics, and I do agree that loot boxes is a terrible way to do these sort of things. But if you look at the battle pass in Overwatch 2, I've played a lot of matches in Overwatch 2, and like, a lot, and I'm only battle pass level 20, for example. Like the progression is laughably slow. It's even mobile game level slow at this point. If we look at other changes that Overwatch 2 has made from the original, it's also got a next gen looking sort of, like the graphics are much more advanced, the particle effects much more advanced. If you look at the surfaces, they're much more detailed, and it runs a lot better on next gen consoles. Loading times are faster. You know, it does have its own upgrades, and it does run a lot better than it used to, which I am happy about, because Overwatch 1 was starting to look a little dated. And it's also changed some of the heroes' roles and abilities, trying to balance them a little bit better, which I think has had mixed results. So if you look at, for example, Doomfist, it's been changed to a tank, and I think that it's a bit of a problem, because Doomfist it was really a bit of a hit. It's like an aerial hero chaser, and like it's really good. It was really good when it was at attackers, just taking out the heroes at the back and the healers, because it was quite good at just charging forward with his abilities and his really good movements. And the difficulty with the tank is it has to have good damage mitigation, and Doomfist only has one ability and it only lasts a few seconds with a long cooldown, so he's not the best tank in my opinion. But I guess we can only wait and see what Blizzard does with his balancing. And we've also got Orisa, so her abilities have been changed completely since launch, which I think is good. I think that she's now a bit overpowered, because if you look at the Reddit, for example, you've got hundreds of players just complaining about Orisa, which is totally understandable, because she is now very strong. Her abilities are extremely overpowered and extremely useful, and you know, her knockback abilities are even better. So any map with edges, you don't really stand a chance unless you've got a teleporting character, or Pharah, of course. So I think if we're going to talk about if Overwatch 2 is actually a sequel, I think we also have to talk about what we actually think a sequel is. So a new sequel has to be a new game in a series, obviously, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because a new game in a series can, you know, obviously you can have a new game, but it's what the game really brings to the table that makes it a true sequel and not just a spin-off. So for example, the game has to bring new content, but it can't just be DLC, so it can't just be a little bit of new content just added onto the game that doesn't really add a huge amount to this continuing story or the themes of the game. So if we look at, for example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it has a lengthy DLC, but that doesn't really count as a sequel because it still continues the main themes of the game, and it just continues the story that the game already started. So I think the line between a sequel and a continuation is quite slim, and if we look at what a sequel also has to do, it also has to bring new features to the game, so like completely new things not seen in the last game. So I don't know, for example, Overwatch 2 does bring in new features such as the push mode, but I think it's really debatable whether that can really be considered enough new content to be a sequel. But I think that ultimately Overwatch 1 is an incredibly hard game to really sequel, if you get what I mean, because, you know, Overwatch 1 was a groundbreaking game when it came out in 2016, and it's also a game that while it does have story, that's sort of like, it's more of the lore level of story rather than story. So for example, Overwatch 2 can't really improve on that, because without its modes that's bringing out next year, which will be PvE, and it will be a new story added to the game, and it will have more details about the characters, and you know, that would, if it launched with that, I think this argument would be a lot easier, because I think if it launched with PvE, then you could really say that it was a sequel. But without that, I think that at the moment as it stands, Overwatch 2 is really just a refresh. I think that it's a refresh of what Overwatch 1 did, and I think that it's also, you know, I think it does bring a lot of good things, but I don't think that it's a sequel in the traditional sense, and I think that the label Overwatch 1.5, people are giving it to it at the moment, I think that does make perfect sense, because I really don't know how this game can be considered a direct sequel, when all it does really is just refresh what Overwatch 1 did, and it also just adds a couple of new things just to keep it a little bit fresh, but it doesn't really add a huge amount to the game as it stands at the moment. So just because Overwatch 2 isn't directly a sequel at the moment, I don't think that I resent the fact that it exists. So Overwatch 1, I think that we can all agree, was undoubtedly stagnated by the time Overwatch 2 released. Like, we hadn't seen a new hero in over 2 years, like, we hadn't really seen new content, the esports league was dying. Overwatch 1 was a game that had its writing on the wall competitively, and I think Activision really didn't know how to handle, you know, the expectations to new content, because if you look at a game like Fortnite, it delivers new content repeatedly on a weekly basis, every single time, and it's always new, it changes it around it. But like the difficulty with Overwatch is that you can't really do that, like not in the same way. There's a lot more to balance because it's a lot more competitive than a game like Fortnite is. So, well, I think that's debatable, but in my opinion anyway, I think it's a lot more competitive because it's a lot quicker, there's a lot more strategy involved, you know. I think it's a very different beast to balance competitively than a game like Fortnite is. As well as the fact that every hero has to fit in with so many different things. So if you think about it, if you add a new hero to Overwatch, it has to balance and play well with every other hero in the game. It has to have a counter, it has to play, you know, it can't be too overpowered, it can't be too underpowered, it has to fit in that perfect slot in the middle. And I think Overwatch 2 does bring new life into the series. I think that it really does, you know, restart and give it a bit of a kick, and I think it really, you know, it brings Overwatch back into relevance like it was in 2016. Like, I've had more fun with Overwatch 2 than I have had with Overwatch 1 in years, and I think that is definitely a good thing. Like, I actually do think that when people argue that they say that Overwatch 2 could have just been an update to Overwatch 1, I think that's kind of difficult, because I think that there would have been a lot more complaints that if Activision had just changed Overwatch 1 to 5v5. Like, I think that change is controversial, but I quite like it personally. I think it plays much faster and much more aggressively, and I think that even having one tank makes it more difficult for that tank player, but I also think that it does mean that the game plays a lot faster, and it's a lot more of a frantic tug of war rather than a sort of attrition, when you sort of have to you know, it's the first person to take out the other player's tanks, and then you can sort of take over the rest of the team. Like, I think that having one tank does make the game, it feels a lot fairer, especially to new players. But I think that Overwatch 2 does ultimately bring a lot of new things that you couldn't really have just done with Overwatch 1. So, as I said before, the 5v5, like, I think you could not just put Overwatch 2 and, you know, into Overwatch 1, as in, you couldn't just update Overwatch 1 to be 5v5. I think players would have absolutely hated it, because then you're changing an actual game that people have a lot of fondness for and a lot of memories of. And the good thing about Overwatch 2 is it technically a completely new game, so people haven't really had a chance to form the memories that they have with Overwatch 1. So by changing it in that way, they haven't, you know, altered people's memories of the game and really changed what people loved about it, because it's entirely new. I think that it is much more challenging to play something like a tank now, because they have a lot more to do, because they have to firstly protect the healers and like the attackers and mitigate the damage, but they also have to be prime damage dealers as well, because, like, you know, the attackers obviously can't pull all the way in that regard, and, like, you know, resources are obviously stretched a lot more thinly, but I do ultimately think that it is a very good change, so I am happy with it. But yeah, I do think that it is a very good, useful refresh of Overwatch, and I do think that eventually, when people learn to accept the changes that it's brought in, I do think that it will revive the franchise and really bring it back to the glory days in 2016, which is good because I really missed Overwatch, and I think a lot of other players did too. I think as a sequel, Overwatch 2 does ultimately land in the middle ground between sequel and continuation, because I think that a lot of what it does bring could have been added as an update. So for example, you have things like the next gen update, that could definitely have been added as just an update to Overwatch 1, and you also got stuff like the new heroes, which could certainly have been added to Overwatch 1, but then you also have a lot of content that couldn't have been. So for example, as I said before, the 5v5, and you also got the PvE mode that's coming out next year, and that could not really have been added to Overwatch 1 without completely changing the way that it works and the landscape of the game. I think that next year, Overwatch 2, well, I think that we'll see if Overwatch 2 can really be a sequel in a traditional sense, because I think once it's added the PvE mode, it's then justifiable to say that it has enough new content to really be considered a brand new game. Because when the PvE mode really does launch, that I think that then we'll have enough. Because I think at the moment, as it stands, Overwatch 2 just simply doesn't have enough brand new things and brand new content added to the game to be really considered a sequel in most people's minds anyway. Because I think that a sequel it does have to add so much more to actually be considered a sequel. And I think that Overwatch 2 doesn't quite get there yet, but I think that it will. And that's the important thing, to be honest, because I think for now, it's enough that the game just released and revived the series, because Overwatch had been stagnating for years before Overwatch 2 came out. I think Activision have handled the way that Overwatch 1 progressed incredibly badly for the last maybe 4 years. I think that Overwatch 2, I think it was needed, to be honest. I think for now, it's a new start that we all wanted and we all needed, because let's be honest, Overwatch 1, even the most die-hard players can admit that the game was dying and it wasn't like it used to be. But I think that people can now argue, whether you agree with the gameplay changes or not, that Overwatch 2 is ultimately a good thing for Overwatch in general, in the way that it exists and that it brings a new audience and that people are actually talking about Overwatch again. Like, if you look at, let's say, the Twitch stats of Overwatch 2, it's now, like, the second highest game on Twitch that's being streamed now? Like, Overwatch has not been at that level for a long time. So I'm very glad that it exists. I think that it was needed. I think it was necessary and essential. I think people will argue that, and I think they'll argue it for years, but I think those people will mainly be arguing not whether it existing is a good thing, but on whether they agree with the changes that it made. I think that's a lot more positive than arguing whether it simply exists, because I think that arguing if it exists I think that ultimately that argument isn't really necessary, because I think that it can only be a good thing that it exists because it brings new life into the series. And whether you agree with the gameplay changes or not, that can only be a good thing. So I hope you guys enjoy this new video style. I'll still be doing the longer video essays every Friday, but every Wednesday I'll now be releasing these shorter videos that will just be giving my opinion on a popular topic. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. Remember to subscribe if you liked it, and remember to like the video as well, as that brings a huge amount of exposure and helps my video actually get around new audiences. And yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Take care and have a good one.